In this example, I'm going to demonstrate how to use Office Connector import with an import file that has a parent-child relationship. In other words, there are records in the import file that serve as a parent record, like an invoice, and then there are records that serve as the detail, like distributions. So in this case, I'm going to use accounts payable invoices. And so for every invoice, the invoice has to have at least one or more distribution records. Now in my list here, I have just a list of entries that ultimately I want these to become distributions under invoices. And you'll notice, for example, that I have like, for example, an invoice 14900, and that has 3 distributions. When I import that into accounts payable, I want that to become just one invoice for the sum total of $700, but that one invoice will have 3 distributions on it. And so this is going to show how we're going to create that kind of an import file where we have the parent invoice and then the 3 distributions under it. So I'm going to start off and first of all recognize that in order to create an import function for the invoice, the parent record, I need to have the amount for the invoice record. And so I'm going to write an Excel formula to do that. There's probably several different ways you could do this. I'm going to use sum if, or some ifs, and I'm just going to say sum up anything in column E. Looking at column A, where it matches the row for that particular, or the value for that vendor on that particular row, and then the same thing with column B. So that just says to sum up all the rows where the vendor and invoice together match any rows in that list. And so if I copy that down, and like I said, there's more than one way to probably arrive at that, but you'll notice now that on all 3 rows I have the dollar amount of the overall invoice. And don't worry about the fact that it's repeated, because we're not going to create 3 separate invoices. We're just going to create one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start creating my import functions. And the first import function I'm going to create is for the invoice itself. So I'll use the import wizard. I'll select AP Invoice import file. The record I want is invoice. I'll identify the particular columns that I want to populate. So I'll use vendor, invoice, amount, invoice date, and accounting date. Keep in mind that your AP settings will dictate which columns may be required. So there may be other columns you would have to use depending on what your settings are. Okay, so then I get to the value step, and I can just go and select the values right off of my spreadsheet. Okay, so at this point I'll use the amount in column G, since that's the invoice amount. And I'll use the same date for the accounting date. Okay, and this is just a message telling me that the TS import function that we're creating could very easily be a hidden column, since it doesn't really return any values that you need to see necessarily. Notice one thing that it did here is it automatically said that it's identifying the invoice in the file using the combination of A and B. So the vendor and invoice together uniquely identifies a given invoice. And that just makes it so that even though I copy this down, and the fact that I have 3 TS import functions here all identifying the same invoice, because of the fact that the combination of vendor and invoice is the same on each of those 3 rows, it's really referring to the same invoice. It's not going to create 3 separate ones, because that combination is the same on all 3 rows. Okay, so that serves as the creation of my invoice. And now I'm going to create the distributions under the invoices. And so again, I'll use the import wizard. Select the import file for AP Invoices. This time I'll select distribution. And now it wants to know what cell contains the parent invoice. And so I can use my cell selector and select the TS import function that contains that. And now the rest of it is just the same as I had before, I'm going to select the columns that I want to populate, and I'm only going to populate the GL expense account and the amount in my example. And of course, like I said before, there may be other columns that you'd want to populate, and some of them might even be required depending on your settings. Okay, so now I'm going to select where those values come from. This time the amount will come from the line item amount right there in column E. I'll click Finish. Okay, and notice then that this TS import function refers back to column H as its parent record. And so I'll copy that down. And that's the extent of the setup that's necessary. Now I'm ready to create an import file with this data. Okay, I want to go ahead and just capture that path so I can just open that up in Notepad when we're done. Okay, so notice what we have here. Office Connector import created an import file where I have a line for the invoice, followed by a line for the distribution. And when I get down here to the one that had 3, again I have a line for the invoice, and then a separate line for each distribution. Okay, that concludes our video.